And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. My name is Don K. Preston, and this is Morning Musings. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I'm sharing with you some thoughts on what happens to the child of God after death. This is a really critical issue having to do with the story of eschatology itself. Because you see, most people believe that man doesn't get to go to heaven, man doesn't receive his, quote, final reward until the end of the millennium. That is, in the new heaven and the new earth. So, if it can be demonstrated that the new creation is a present reality, if it can be demonstrated, for instance, that man enters into the most holy place today, when they die, then very clearly the end of the millennium has arrived. The Lord has come, resurrection has occurred. That's how critical this is. It's not just simply a question of what happens to man when he dies. The question of what happens when we die has directly to do with the issues of the millennium, the parousia, and the resurrection. Now, in the last segment I suggested to you, as we examine the story of Abraham and how he longed for the new Jerusalem. He longed for Zion. He longed for the better resurrection. He saw that in Jesus' day. Well, what Abraham was longing for was, to express it like this, the reuniting of heaven and earth. Now I want you to think with me on this very quickly. When man was in the garden, heaven and earth were united. There was no sin. There was no barrier between man and God. Heaven and earth were one. They were united. Man, I am convinced, was always intended to experience physical death as the transition from the earthly existence into the heavenly existence. Man was in, as he was in the garden, man was in the most holy place, i.e. the presence of God. But sin separated man from God. This is why in Jacob's vision, in Jacob's dream, he saw a ladder. Pardon me. He saw a ladder with angels ascending and descending. That was indicative of the time coming in which once again heaven and earth would be united. And remember John chapter 1, in which, was it Philip or Nathaniel? Memory fails me at the moment. Saw the vision of the Son of Man and angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. This is the story of the reuniting of heaven and earth. Now, the universal scope of this is seen in the fact that this promise was made to Adam and Eve long before Abraham ever came on the scene. So the promise was not strictly to Abraham and his seed. The promise was to Adam and Eve. That the time was coming in which heaven and earth would be united. Now, clearly, the question of the nature of the death of Adam comes into play here. There's no question about that. But the whole point of it is that the focus of biblical eschatology is that heaven and earth would be united. Listen very quickly to Ephesians chapter 1. It was God's eternal purpose that in the dispensation, or stewardship, better translation, of the fullness of time, he might gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth in him. In him also we have obtained an inheritance, being predestinated according to the purpose of him. Do you see that God's eternal purpose God's purpose before Abraham ever arrived on the scene, God's eternal purpose was to reunite heaven and earth, to bring man back into his presence. Whether man would be on earth or whether man transitioning from earth to heaven, there would be no barrier. And thus, Paul, anticipating the imminent consummation of the work of Christ, said he had a desire to depart and to be with Christ. He did not see physical death as his enemy. I asked Joel McDermott in my debate with him, is physical death the enemy of the child of God? He said yes. Ask yourself the question, if the child of God is redeemed and forgiven, the sin that separates man from God is now removed, and we no longer live under the penalty and the consequence of that sin. Just exactly how is physical death the enemy of the child of God? You see, if physical death is still the enemy of the child of God, Christ has accomplished no forgiveness for man. Sin separated heaven from earth. Sin divided man from God. In Christ, forgiveness is ours. If forgiveness removes the only thing that is a barrier between God and man, then how and why is physical death the enemy of the child of God? Folks, the traditional view of death, the traditional view that physical death is man's enemy, is false to the core. It denies the reality of forgiveness now. But if in fact we are forgiven, if in fact we are redeemed through the blood of Christ now, then we are in the holy place, most holy place. Heaven and earth has been reunited. And when we die, the natural process of the human experience, we transition into heaven itself. That's why Abraham longed to see Jesus' day. He saw it, and he was glad. Hey, thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We'll have more. You have a great day. See you on the flip side.